Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. We have a very strong turnout of folks joining us today. So, again, my name is Steve Choi. I have been involved in immigration issues for about 25 years. I'm dating myself. But from 2013 to 2020, I served as the executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition, and I currently serve as the founder and lead strategist of the Ellis Island Initiative. I am so glad to be working with Neighbors Link on this webinar. And I've been fortunate to work with Neighbors Link for many, many years on a whole host of different campaigns, convenings around bringing immigrants and also other communities together, especially in Westchester County, but really across the state. Neighbors Link was such a great ally and a strong participant in our driver's licenses for all campaign in 2019. And Corolla serves as the board chair of the New York Immigration Coalition. And I want to note that one of my first experiences with Neighbors Link was actually in 2015 when I worked really closely with Corolla and Neighbors Link because we were hosting then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, and we were hosting her for a speech at this national immigration conference. And so Corolla and I worked together, and we actually lined up a worker at one of the restaurants that the Clintons frequented quite often. And so right before Hillary gave this speech around immigration at this national conference, we were able to get this worker who was very involved in Neighbors Link programs, and he actually had a one-on-one conversation with Hillary Clinton about his own experience as an immigrant, as an undocumented immigrant who was looking to achieve status. And so that was a really, really important moment and really had an impact on Hillary when she was considering it. Of course, Hillary Clinton did not win the presidential election in 2016. And now we face a very, very different situation 8 years later and a very, very different landscape around immigration. So I think with less than 2 weeks to go before the election, I think it's actually very timely to have this conversation. And it's timely because immigration is on the minds of everybody right now. Whether it's the situation with migrants and asylum seekers, not only in Westchester County, but across the nation. And I think what we want to do with today's discussion is we want to get past some of the hyperbole around immigrants. We want to get past some of the crazy accusations about immigrants eating cats and dogs, which is so unfortunate. And we're in the middle of this election season, but we want to actually get past that. We want to instead focus on some of the more nuts and bolts questions and the issues around immigration, particularly when it comes to the economy and the workforce. So in the course of this discussion, we've got some amazing panelists today. We want to talk about things like the larger economic landscape and how immigrants fit into that. How do they do so in Westchester? What's the situation in Westchester County and the Hudson Valley? What kind of impact are immigrants having? So we want to talk about that. We also want to talk about some of the evolving changes around immigration law. And it's always changing. There are always changes that are happening. Even last weekend, when the Biden administration announced changes to temporary protected status, that all is going to have an impact. And we also want to be able to flesh out some information about what employers need to know to confidently hire and support immigrant workers in Westchester, but also more broadly speaking. In the course of our work around the Ellis Island Initiative, which is to reach out to non-immigrant stakeholders and local communities across the state, we hear this all the time. Businesses say, well, I don't want to hire someone illegal, or what exactly can I do to support these immigrant workers? Or immigrant workers have temporary status. What does that mean? Are they going to lose that status at some point? Is that going to put me in jeopardy as an employer? So we want to flesh out some of that information. And we also want to make sure that folks who are not employers or not immigration activists, but just community members who care about this issue, we want to make sure that we provide some information about how community members can get involved and share the right kinds of information for friends, for neighbors, and other allies in the community. So that's what we're trying to do today. in this conversation. Before I get to introducing some of the panelists, and I'm going to go quickly through that, but I wanted to just talk about a couple of housekeeping items for the audience before we get started. We're going to be talking until 1:45, and then we've allotted time at the end of this discussion for some audience questions. I want to note that there's a Q&A chat box, and so please type your questions in the Q&A chat box, not in the regular chat box, because that's going to be for something differently. So if you want to put those questions in the Q&A, some of those questions are going to be answered in writing in that Q&A piece. And then others, we'll pick some of those out. We'll address them during the Q&A segment. Throughout the hour, we're going to share some links and resources in the chat section of the Zoom. And so I encourage folks to use that to introduce yourself. Actually, if I can ask folks to use that chat box to put your name, your organization, and any comments that you might have into the chat section of the Zoom, that would be great. But I want to note that we're going to be not going to be taking questions from the chat box. So please reserve your questions for the Q&A and reserve the chat section for your own self-introduction, for other comments that you might want to make. So that's some housekeeping items that we did want to make sure that we're going to be able to address before we get into that. So thank you, Adam, for kicking that off in the chat box. So with that, I'm going to introduce our excellent panelists for today. We've got some great experts joining us. First, I want to introduce David Disegard-Kallick. He is the director of the Immigration Research Initiative and has long been one of the most respected experts when it comes to data and immigration. He is the go-to resource that so many of us go to when we have questions or we need some data points. So we're lucky to have David on. Jason Chapin is the Director of Workforce Development for the Westchester County Association. So we're very lucky to have Jason on talking about workforce development. And again, this is something that we hear time and time again through the Ellis Island Initiative is where is that interstitial tissue between immigrant serving providers and employers? And so Jason and his colleagues working on workforce development here in Westchester and across the state, they're so important in providing that interstitial tissue. And I think really are looking at things not only from what immigrants might need and immigrant service providers, but also what employers might need as well. So Jason, we're lucky to have him to share some light on that. And last but not least, we have Karen Anderson-Ponzer, who I've known and worked with for many, many years. She is the director of the Neighbors Link Community Law Practice. So is an expert on a lot of the legal changes that are happening, what's the legal background, and really how can folks make sure that they have the right information when they are talking about this issue, which can be so controversial. And she is an expert and can share some of those insights as well. So with that, with this esteemed group of panelists, we actually wanted to kick off these questions. So I actually wanted to pose a couple of questions to all the panelists and to welcome any of the panelists to answer this question. But first, I wanted to kick it off by asking, what do you believe has been the most significant economic contributions of immigrant workers in Westchester County? And as a corollary, how do you see this evolving in the coming years? So I wanted to open it up to our panelists to tackle this question. Maybe Jason, you want to go ahead and kick us off?
Sure, and my perspective is really from the fact that I see economic development, workforce development, education and training inextricably linked. They're all factors, and if you think about our region, Westchester County, the region and beyond, there's a long history of immigration, and there's a long history of immigrants filling positions, and I talk a lot to colleges, universities, and employers, and we have a talent shortage now, and we've had a talent shortage for quite some time. And there are a number of positions in various sectors that have gone unfilled for quite some time. And when those positions are unfilled, it impacts our employers, and it impacts our economy, and it impacts our future.
Maybe,
Great. And I want to welcome actually, David, before you go, I actually wanted to welcome Karen, and then David, I wanted to use that opportunity for you to get more in depth on this. So Karen, I wanted to see if you wanted to share.
Absolutely. At Neighbors Link on a daily basis, we're seeing immigrant workers of all backgrounds and skill levels who are eager to work and contribute to their community and support their families. We see immigrant doctors, lawyers, engineers, as well as landscapers, chefs, other restaurant workers, small business owners of many kinds. And immigrant workers of all kinds are making an impact on our economy every day. We also see employers who are desperate to hire immigrant workers. As we just heard, the problem is that we have a complex immigration system that puts up barriers for both workers and employers. Immigrants are already a critically important part of the workforce in Westchester County and will be even more important in the future. So it's so important that we figure out how to have an immigration system that recognizes the importance of immigrants to a thriving economy.
Thank you, Karen. And now I want to invite David. And David, this is your bread and butter, talking about the economic contributions, and you've done so much there. So I wanted to welcome you to provide some thoughts and insights there.
yeah, thanks. I mean, so I just wanted to start with, what Jason and Karen are talking about is the way things are, the shortages, the challenges in filling jobs. That's today. We're a couple of weeks away from an election where there's a threat of really drastic change and extreme cutbacks and deportations around immigration that could, I think, have a really drastic effect, not just in holding back the potential for growth, but really in shrinking the economy in Westchester and around the country. So I won't give a lot of statistics today, but maybe just to frame the discussion to begin with. I mean, it's about 1 million people altogether in Westchester. Some 260,000 of them are people who are born in another country who are immigrants. About 10,000 of those undocumented people. I mean, that's about 26% of the population and an even higher share of the labor force. So, I mean, that just shows, I think, how significant immigrants are across the board. So sure, of course, maybe most visibly in jobs like, as landscapers or in construction or home health aides or Uber and Lyft drivers, babysitters, a lot of the things that make our quality of life what it is in a day-to-day way. But something like a deportation regime would also affect families and new immigrants who wouldn't be undocumented. So, doctors and nurses and computer specialists and accountants who are really critical to Karen mentioned the small business owners, really critical to the lifeblood of the economy.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. And I mean, it's so remarkable seeing the demographic change. I mean, my family has lived in Westchester for more than 40 years. And, when we first moved to Westchester, we were the first immigrant family on the block. And now the idea that more than 1 out of every 4 Westchester residents is an immigrant I mean, it's just tremendous, the kind of change that's happening. And it's a reality, right? Immigrants are part of Westchester County. I wanted to actually stick on this topic, and David, you mentioned some of the potential changes that could be happening. So I actually just wanted to dig into that, right? There's some changes in immigration policy that are already happening right now in terms of the Biden administration, some of their shifts. And so I'm just in looking ahead, like, what does this look like? How can this potentially impact the labor market and the economic contributions of immigrants?
I mean,
So, David, if you want to talk about
yeah,
that.
I'm happy to say a little more about that. I mean, I feel like you may have seen there have been studies to look at what happens if the immigrants who are here sort of disappear from the scene, and there's already a very serious impact of that. That would be a really big detriment to the economy. But I really feel like that would just be the tip of the iceberg, because if you think about what it takes to remove immigrants, and if you look at the kinds of specific policies that the Trump campaign is talking about, I mean, they're talking about rounding up immigrants on a bone-chilling scale. I just personally, I just feel like the idea of detention camps and mass deportations and show me your papers laws. I mean, it makes my grandparents roll in their graves. And I feel like the impact would be even broader than just the fact that people will be disappearing from the jobs that they're in. It would mean all of us having a daily life that's really very different than what we know today.
Got it. Thanks, David. And I think just talking specific that, and that's really important just to think about the broader impact of potential deportations that could happen in a Trump administration, or at least things that he's threatened. I did want to focus a little bit around workforce and thinking about what are some of the challenges or gaps that exist, and like the current gaps that exist in terms of hiring and integrating immigrant workers. We hear so much that there's 500,000 open jobs across the state. And so, the fact that there are so many immigrants that have come into the state recently, it seems like there's an opportunity there to be able to match those. So I wanted to open it up to the panelists as a broader set and see what are some of the challenges or gaps that you see. So maybe we can start with Jason if you have some thoughts about these broader challenges or gaps.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to start national and then I'm going to go local. There's a monthly report the Department of Labor puts out. It's a JOLTS report. It's about job openings across the country. There are currently 8 million unfilled jobs in the US. In
Wow.
Westchester alone, there are 6,000 unfilled jobs. The number, varies from month to month, but 1/3 of those jobs are in healthcare. Healthcare is the largest growth sector in our region. So that's all the hospitals, the medical groups, the health centers, assisted living facilities, and so forth. And if you think about mass deportation, I was watching the news this morning and there was reports saying that if there were mass deportation, our GDP, our economy would take an 8.9% hit, which would be more severe than the economic downturn we experienced in 2009. So if you think about it, we have all these job openings that are unfilled, and we're not growing fast enough to fill them. And then if you take away a quarter of our workforce, then that's going to tank our economy. And it's also important to recognize that there's been a lot of shifts. I've read a few of the census reports, and I believe 2010 and 2020, without immigration, there would not be population growth in Westchester and our region. So that's, a direct factor in our economic growth. And I know, since I work with a bunch of colleges and universities, some of them have Hispanic institution designation, like Mercy. About 1/3 of their students are first generation or foreign born. So when I think of our colleges and universities and BOCES, all our education and training providers, they're training our future workforce. So without them, we wouldn't have the necessary labor force that we need, not only to sustain our economy, but to grow our economy. So we have to look at all sides of this equation and not just look at this as a political issue. We have to look at it as an economic issue and a workforce issue.
Great. And just to follow up on that, Jason, I mean, what are some of the nuts and bolts challenges? I mean, we have population that already is making up a big part of the workforce. You have more folks who have come to the state looking for work, and employers, like you said, healthcare, hospitals looking to hire them. What are some of the challenges? Why is there not more of a connection being made there to be able to get them? Like, what are some of the challenges that are existing now?
Yeah, this is anecdotal, but in some cases in healthcare, you have to be proficient in English. So
Mhm.
some immigrants, newer immigrants, they need to improve their English skills, which may delay when they join the workforce. But we also see that there are a lot of immigrants and non-immigrants that are facing the same challenges. A lot of people would love to work and live in Westchester, but there are some barriers that we're all facing: housing costs, transportation costs and limitations, childcare. So it's a complicated situation. You can't just point to one, two, or three things that explains why we aren't able to be at full employment. But at the same time, the New York State Department of Labor for our region recognizes that we are at record employment and record low unemployment. So, we're in great shape economically, but that doesn't mean that we've solved all of our shortcomings or our challenges. And if we're able to address some of these issues, then I think it would be a significant boost to economic development.
Got it. That's really helpful. Karen, I wanted to ask, from the immigrant's perspective or from the immigrant worker's perspective, what are some of the challenges or gaps that they are facing in terms of being able to find those open jobs that Jason talked about?
What I see is that the biggest challenge is the complexity of immigration law itself. There's a lot of conversation about work permits, but it's not just applying for and receiving work permits and the delays around that process. It's also the fact that people need a visa, an underlying legal status of some kind to be eligible for a work permit or a pending application. And we see many workers and potential workers who are trying to resolve legal barriers to keep them unable to apply for a work permit or to apply for a visa or other status that would create eligibility, a legal basis for them to work. We're seeing highly skilled people, even among the asylum seekers who are recent arrivals, but many others, doctors, engineers, lawyers in the recent group, to people who work in landscaping, and they all have these types of barriers. And I just have a couple of anecdotes that I think will be really lay this out for folks here today. So first of all, talking about the healthcare industry, I know from working with many asylum seekers that where many of them are going now, as soon as they get a work permit, they're moving into institutional elder care. Many of them have excellent English skills, and even if they have limited skills, they can perform essential functions in providing services to the people who are in nursing homes, assisted living. And they are filling those jobs, and those jobs are vulnerable if those people aren't able to stay in those jobs, renew work permits. Couple other quick anecdotes is a doctor that I worked with, excellent asylum case. His case has likely been granted at this time. It took him 1 year, over a year, he came into this country very highly skilled, but because there's no interface to quickly get him into the position where that I know exists, where there's a shortage of workers for that, there's no path. So instead, he spent time trying to find a lawyer to assist him in his asylum application, and then waited for another 6 months to be able to get a work permit based on it. So that's a year of a gap between a position that's a big need in demand. There's a huge need for that people to perform this service, and his ability to do it. And just one other classic example of the sort of vulnerability that people see is another case that I worked with of a gentleman who had status. He had based on a pending application. He was a trusted and relied on store manager for a local business in this area. There was a family emergency, a death outside the country. The family left to attend the funeral, and because of the complexity of the law, then they're stranded. Separate their U.S. citizen children, return to the United States. Parents are stranded. The employer loses this employee, changes his whole business. And just because people didn't understand this very technical aspect of the law, it's a huge obstacle. And people grossly underestimate the complexity of the law itself as a barrier here.
Great, Karen. And I wanted to stick with you on this and just, I think you're talking about some of the legal challenges and the complexities and why that can throw up roadblocks, not just in people's employment, but also their legal status here. I'm wondering what can employers proactively do to support their workforce from a legal perspective?
That's a great question. I would say at the most basic level, what employers can be doing is making sure that their employees who may have immigration legal questions know about and have access to respected and responsible legal practitioners who can give them the private advice they need. Employers need to be careful in this context because you always have to be mindful about national origin discrimination. So it can be difficult for employers to, on the one hand, comply with the law and on the other hand, not violate it. So if you think an employee has questions or they have concerns or vulnerabilities, what they need to talk to is a competent practitioner. I mean, later on in the conversation, we could talk about what happens to people when they talk to somebody who's not trustworthy. But making sure people have the individualized assessment with someone they can trust is critically important, because immigration law is so complex and so fluid. It's really hard to understand that as an outsider. It's changing all the time.
Great, thanks, Karen. That's really helpful. And that's a lot for employers to be able to be thinking about as well. So Jason, I wanted to come back to you and ask if you had thoughts, what are some best practices for employers that are hiring immigrant workers? Would love to hear more from the employer perspective about what they can be doing in the right kind of way.
Well, I'll start with healthcare. In healthcare, you have to be documented. So when someone completes a training program and they get the credential and they pass the exam, employers are going to seek them out and interview them and likely hire them. And we have 2 training programs, and employers are our partners, and they love these programs. One of them state funded, one of them's county funded, and they're focused on healthcare training. So we get people through the training. And by the way, the programs are open to any and all under and unemployed individuals. So it's not just
Wow.
focused on immigrants or non-immigrants, it's open to all. And we are finding that the vast majority who are applying and enrolling in the program are first generation or foreign born, and they're all completing the program, and the employers are hiring them because they have the credential and they are excited to work in healthcare. And we're finding that the vast majority of them are bilingual Hispanic females. So if
Mhm.
you're thinking about our future workforce in healthcare, don't be surprised if it's dominated by um, Hispanic females. We do have, males in the program and immigrants from other countries, but it's a trend, and I think it's going to continue or grow. And employers are very happy about these training programs. I would say that employers, you hear two points from employers. Either they want someone who's completely trained and ready on day one, or they want somebody who's trainable that they are going to train. Either way,
Mhm.
employers know what they're doing when they're interviewing candidates and selecting candidates, and they work it out whether they want the training or they do the training. They know how to onboard people. They know how to retain them. And so I don't have any concerns from the employer's point of view.
And is there anything more that employers could do? I mean, how do you feel like the employers as a whole, as a broader sector, like what more could they do to be able to promote the kind of integration of the future workforce, as you said?
Well, I think there are a couple things, and I'll start with hospitals, but I think this applies to a lot of the other sectors. The hospital nearest to me, half of their workforce lives outside the county, and that's primarily because of the cost of living. The hospital would benefit, we'd all benefit if people could live closer to where they work. So if you have more affordable housing, healthcare, transportation, childcare, more people would be able to live closer to work. And I think that would benefit the local schools and the businesses. And, my philosophy, when anybody gets hired, it benefits that individual, their family, the community, the employer, and the economy. So it's great when we're able to think about all the issues that are interconnected and how we can address some of the cost issues. But I also
Mhm.
think that there are a lot of employers who need to promote their workforce. If they're big proponents of DEI, then they should champion the fact that they have a diverse workforce and talk about all the benefits that they are getting from a diverse workforce, and talk about some of the things they would like to do that they're not currently doing or doing more of. So I think that they could benefit from doing more open houses so people can learn about opportunities and begin the interview process, or they could do more in terms of supporting organizations that are supporting immigrants.
Great, thanks. And just as a follow-up, I'm curious, you talked about what employers could do, but I'm curious if you have thoughts about what localities or the county or the state could be doing more to support employers to be able to really engage with this potential workforce.
Yeah, I know the county has a separate department, and I know they've been very active and proactive in immigration. And I also know that the New York State Department of Labor, they're always doing events, and they're open to any and all job seekers. So there really aren't any limitations that I'm aware of on the state or county level. And I think there's one other thing that would be beneficial, and that's trying to get more people to understand that these issues are easily resolved if you can get all the stakeholders around the table. You know, a lot of times we say it's not my responsibility, or I'm waiting for someone else to do it. But we have to look at the upside potential when we're able to work through some of these challenges.
Great, great, thanks. That's super helpful. And I just want to note, that's been our finding as well when with the Ellis Island Initiative, when we've done convenings in Westchester County and across the state. We found that, bringing together businesses, chambers, employers, labor as well, faith leaders, local electeds, there really is this critical mass of local folks who really believe that, there are practical solutions to some of these challenges. And if we are able to use and leverage some of these solutions, we can actually find a great deal of opportunity as well. So I think that's a really insightful point, Jason. Thank you for making that. Now I wanted to switch a little bit and Karen, go back to you, because I think, there are a lot of excellent employers out there who are really looking to engage with immigrants in the right way, bring them on the workforce, but also, sometimes they're unscrupulous folks. And so, and also just immigrants can sometimes just run afoul of the law, sometimes in an unwitting fashion. They might not even know that they're violating some provision of immigration law. So I wanted to just ask you, Karen, to talk about that. How can immigrant workers protect their rights? Also, just be mindful of protecting themselves outside of the workforce context, and just make sure that they're protected overall. So I wanted to see, Karen, if you could weigh in around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the core way that immigrant workers can protect themselves is by always availing themselves of legal education and legal services to get information and updated information about their eligibility for their possible eligibility for legal status, and what they need to do to maintain their legal status. Because, as I said, immigration law is very complex, and the challenge that people have, and this is what's so dangerous and for individuals, and where there's so much opportunity to solve problems, is that even if you're in one status, if you try to transition to another status and there's a delay in the processing of those two applications, suddenly an immigrant worker can find that they've run afoul of immigration law just because of a technical issue or even a delay in the USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, adjudication of their claim. So there's a lot of complexity and a lot of variables that these folks are dealing with on their own, and they really shouldn't be. They need to be getting the right information to be sure that they know that their rights, that they know what their legal options are, and they're in the immigration context, and also that they know what their rights are as a worker regardless. I do think something that we see that's a regular problem for immigrant workers is if there's issues around their legal status, or if an employer who's unscrupulous thinks there could be, that those people are much more vulnerable to labor abuses and discrimination and unpaid wages and those sorts of problems, and they can feel very disempowered about what they can do to protect themselves. There's definitely some legislative remedies. We have in Westchester County, we have the Immigrant Protection Act, and there's an effort at the state level to pass New York for All, which in the enforcement context would give immigrant workers and immigrants in our region statewide, a feeling of safety when they interact with law enforcement or report a crime or seek to protect their rights. But there's a lot of fear around that. That's compounded by complexity of the law. And I think a lot of times people feel very frightened and don't know where to turn to for reliable information, which makes them very vulnerable.
Great. And that's a great segue, Karen, to my next question, which is really open to all members of the panel. We've got a lot of great community members, allies, and other stakeholders. And I wanted to ask, how can community members play a role in advocating for immigrant workers and ensuring that they have the support and the opportunities they need to be able to thrive? So I want to open this up to David and Jason and Karen as well.
Or maybe
David, go ahead.
I should really leave it to Jason and Karen, who can speak more locally. I mean, I think people can all be involved, right? And but maybe I'm sure you have some more specific things you can tell them about what they can do in Westchester.
Well, one thing that comes to mind, there's an organization called Nonprofit Westchester. It's an umbrella organization with about 300 members, nonprofits and businesses and others. And, working with some of these other organizations that really have the relationships in all communities and with all the different groups, I think is very helpful. And I think county government is great. I know elected officials, they put out a lot of newsletters. They put out a lot of information. As a matter of fact, a couple legislators that I get newsletters from, they're bilingual. So I think these are all great efforts. I think libraries are great sources of information and sharing information. Westchester Library System does a tremendous job. I think there are a lot of also individuals who are champions and do a great job of connecting people and sharing information. So I think there's a lot going on. There's always room for more. And I know that Neighbors Link works with an organization called Upwardly Global, and I love what they do. They help individuals who earned credentials, degrees, skills abroad, and they're trying to get them recognized here in the US. And I think the more we can recognize those credentials, the better. It seems very counterproductive to have an individual who may have a medical degree abroad to have them have to start over in the US. So I think that there are a lot of great resources that we can tap, and there are a lot of great organizations that we can partner with. But I think that there's always a need to do more, and sometimes it's just a matter of additional funding. Just a matter of additional funding, like there's some magic pot we can all tap into.
Well, yeah. Thank you, Jason. Karen, I know that you had also mentioned some potential legislation, some resources as well. So I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about
Absolutely. There's several different ways that people, employers, other community members, anybody participating in this program can help in this issue. And definitely part of it is advocating for legislation at the New York State level that would provide, first of all, access to legal services for any immigrant New Yorker facing deportation. And people, and what I always say is people think about, oh, well, that sounds expensive. What about, but given everything you've heard today in this panel, I really think you have to think about legal services for immigrants in a state like New York is the same as funding roads and bridges. It's an investment in the economic future of this state, and we should be behind that. And the same regarding New York for All, the statewide version of the Immigrant Protection Act, which has been enormously successful in Westchester. Has made the entire county safer. This would protect immigrant New Yorkers who feel that they can't trust that they can interact with law enforcement to protect a crime or protect a harm they may have experienced on a work site or any place because they're afraid that they're going to get turned over to immigration enforcement, which could be obviously a much more serious problem depending on policy changes that are forthcoming. If we get behind these things, we'll be protecting our immigrant workers and immigrant families. And there's definitely We'll be providing additional materials throughout, but it's also so important to know that at the federal level, there really are a couple of there's some basic things that those of us in the field know that we could do to make some changes that would be transformative in creating pathways for people who are skilled and want to work and want to be what people call legal in this country, that would make it possible for them to do that and to fully realize their dreams and make our economy as robust as we know it can be.
Great, thanks, Karen. And David, I know you're always looking at legislation on the state level, on the federal level, as Karen mentioned. So I'm curious if you have thoughts.
Well, I think so much, at the federal level is where any kind of real immigration reform, any overall immigration policies happen, and so much hinges on this election. I think not just on the presidential election, but also on the Senate and House elections. I mean, it's kind of staggering to me. I mean, I think I first met you, Steve, many years ago, and working on and around also federal immigration reform, and it's been at that time in the 2006, 7, it was already 20 years since any kind of major immigration reform had happened, and now it's more like 40, and it just seems like it has to happen at some point soon. So I really hope that we're moving towards something like that. On the other hand, I feel like we're on such a knife edge, and I'm really afraid that we could be going in drastically a different direction.
Great. And I wanted to just pick up on that again for all the panelists, right? We're talking about being on a knife edge for this election. Who knows what's going to happen in 10 days from now in the November elections? We're either going to be having a Harris administration or a Trump administration. So I wanted to ask all of you, looking ahead, what do you see as the key steps that local businesses and policymakers and community members, allies, what can folks do to ensure that immigrant workers can contribute to a Westchester, to the economy, to the community? And what do we do in a Trump administration?
I can speak to that.
Sure, go ahead, Karen.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd say that no matter what, I think, first of all, what we can all do, regardless of the outcome, is lean in on this. No matter what happens after this election, Neighbors Link is going to continue to be here. We'll provide immigration legal services, regardless of what we need to do to protect the immigrant community here. We do, as well as training for workers, advocacy for just policies, English classes, programming for parents and their children. We're going to do the work that we've always been doing, and we know that community members like the folks here are going to continue to show up. Under the last, under the past, not the current administration, but the past one, we pivoted our work. We were doing a lot of clinics around people preparing guardianship and safety plans. And we know if, depending on the outcome of election, if expedited removal is expanded nationwide, we already know what we have to do, which is have everybody be prepared to walk around with their packets showing that they are an exception to that draconian and inhumane process. So, we're going to be we know what we need to do, and we're just going to be doing it. And I think that's how we're coping with the anxiety around this, is we know the drill, and we're going to be here to get it done.
Great, thanks. Jason, I wanted to invite you to also see if you had any thoughts around that as
well. Well, we're an economic and workforce development organization. We really, we do advocacy, but we don't take political positions. However, I would urge anybody who feels that we have a very strong economy and they like having full employment and record low unemployment, that steady the course is a better option than a radical departure.
Great. And David, I know you've talked about your feelings about what would happen in a regime that was going to push mass deportations and such, but I wanted to see if you had any thoughts or recommendations for some of the participants about, what can be done to ensure that immigrants continue to be a key part of Westchester's economy and communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think So I do think so much hinges on what happens in a couple of weeks that it's hard to make practical plans right now. But I feel like one thing that seems really clear to me is the way that the discourse has deteriorated in this country. I mean, I feel like we I grew up with the idea. I mean, of course, my family is also like so many background of immigrants, but um, with the idea that immigrants were an important part of the country, the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, those were like symbols of what we think is so great about America. Sometimes we didn't live up to it as much as we might have, but it was just a core to what we thought it was to be American. And I just think we need to get back to that. I think to recognize the the cultural, moral, like why we think it's who we are, and also the economic part of it. It is really a big
Mm,
part of this country, and it's really been something that we have benefited from, all of us, the diversity, the economic vitality that comes from having a robust immigration. So I think
mhm.
I, I would say the narrative, if you want to call it that,
Yeah.
is as
Mhm.
important to me at this moment as the specific policies.
Great, great. And related to that, David, you put some resources into the chat around and I think it's so critical to have that data around the economy to be part of that narrative. So I wanted to just see if you had anything further to say about some of your research around the economic contributions and how that can be part of the narrative.
Um, Sure. I mean, I think it's odd to me. There's just such an enormous gap between what economists know for sure about immigration and what the public seems to be open to thinking. I mean, we know for sure that immigrants expand the economy. When they do, it creates more job opportunities for them and also for US-born residents. More workers means more consumers as well, and more business owners and overall economic growth. So I put in the chat, yeah, some one pagers about New York State and the U.S. and other states if you're interested, to try to make some of those points as well.
Great,
And
great.
if I could add one thing, Steve, I would say another thing folks can do is uh, in addition to all the great materials, David and Jason, that you're discussing, folks can always go to the Neighbors link. You can Google Neighbors link, myths and realities. And so, because
Mm,
I couldn't resist the impulse to just add a couple numbers right there, that households
mhm,
led by immigrants contributed a total of 382.9 billion in federal taxes and 196.3 billion in combined state and local taxes annually.
mm,
There's a lot more billions in this little bit information I'm reading. The contributions of immigrants to this economy are enormous and very real.
mhm.
And we rely on them in all kinds of ways that we take for granted.
I put in the
Absolutely.
chats a report that we did about the taxes paid by immigrants, including immigrants who are undocumented. And of course, you're right. It's very big. And one of the questions was, I think, how does that happen and what should happen? I mean, most of the state and local taxes you pay are a lot of it is sales taxes, which everybody pays, right? Property taxes, which even if you're renting, you're helping to pay for the property taxes paid for by the owners of the apartment or house. And then about half of people who are undocumented actually file income tax returns as well. We know this because we can see the numbers coming in actually, and the
Mhm.
dollars coming in, even though in many cases people are excluded from the very programs that they're paying for, like Social
Yeah.
Security or like unemployment compensation.
Yeah. And I just put a link into the chat because we worked with David with the Ellis Island Initiative to put out a report around the economic impact of immigrants in Long Island. And that was actually great because we had a conversation. We were talking about the taxes and we are talking about increased money going into local and state tax coffers. And Bruce Blakeman, the county executive, had to respond and basically say, that's not true. We have to pay all these other costs, but he obviously had no facts to back that up. So I think to me, that is an example of how we can help to shift the narrative by talking about the contributions and the positives and forcing folks who are trying to make political points, just trying to score political points, to kind of come up with their own facts to rebut that, which in this case they weren't able to do. So I thought that was a really great example of how using some of this data around economic impact could help in a very little way to be able to shift the narrative there. So I know we're a couple minutes behind schedule, but I did want to shift to the question and answer period. And just wanted to, I think there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I wanted to also, just wanted to encourage folks to put more questions into the Q&A. And I know Adam had a question. Are programs like sanctuary cities in place to protect, support immigrants and other stakeholders who care? So I wanted to open that up to the panelists to see if folks wanted to answer that.
I can speak to that, but others can too.
Go ahead, Karen.
Like I said earlier, the Immigrant Protection Act in Westchester County is a great law that told the immigrant residents, immigrant New Yorkers who are residents in this county, that you can safely interact with county officials, you can report a crime, you can get your rights protected, and without fear of being referred to immigration enforcement, because remember, immigration law is a civil violation, like tax violations of the tax code are civil. This is vastly just civil violations. So people are afraid to interact with the local government because of their immigration status or concerns about it. So the IPA resolved that. And the New York for All, if passed, would accomplish the same thing at the state level. So definitely, I'm glad to say that Westchester County is making an investment in the safety of its immigrant residents, and we can all support passage of New York for All this year.
Great. That's an excellent point. And I remember when County Executive Latimer signed the Immigrant Protection Act into law in 2018. And, that was really exciting. And I want to reflect the fact that Corolla worked so hard and was just a real leader in the coalition that worked to make that happen. And it really was groundbreaking. It was one of the first examples of a local county in New York putting a law like that into place. So kudos to Corolla and the Neighbors Link team for playing such a pivotal role in making that happen. I noticed there's another question in the Q&A about healthcare for all legislation, which would make sure that undocumented folks could be able to get health insurance. So I wanted to open that up. I don't know, David, if you want to weigh in around that.
Glad to. I mean, I think that would be a New York State law that was, in my opinion, a great idea. I think there's no advantage to people being without the ability to get health care. It's bad for them, obviously, and their families. It's bad for their employers. And I mean, Jason, I don't know if you want to say something about, but having more people have healthcare coverage, I would say is also good for the hospitals and doctors. You don't want to have people without the ability to pay for something they need.
Yeah, we all know preventative care is much better than treatment. And we know that, hospitals are going to treat any and all patients, but it's much harder to treat somebody who has not gotten the necessary tests and exams and regular health care. It only increases the cost and likelihood that they're going to have severe health issues. So I think we have to look at the benefits of investing and broadening healthcare access versus limiting it.
If I could add one thing, I would say another advocacy point here would be advocating for coverage for all, which would be a New York State legislation that would expand health insurance for immigrant New Yorkers, regardless of status.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Karen. Great. And I don't know, Clark, I think, Clark, you wanted to pose a question. There we go. Are cooperative business models viable for protecting undocumented immigrants, since you do not have to be a citizen? So maybe Karen, if you want to tackle that question. You're on mute, Karen.
There you go. Well, what I'd say is there's many ways that I'm not sure exactly what Clark you're referencing when you talk about cooperative business models, but I'll tell you, I think I have an idea, so I'm going to give it my best shot. There are many ways that community members through working with neighbors.
Karen,
Yeah.
just one second. I think he's talking about worker-owned co-ops.
Oh, of course. That's what I thought. Yes, they
That's my
absolutely
understanding.
are.
Yes.
Because
Mhm.
that's exactly right. And you bring up thank you for that clarification. There definitely are ways in which and one alternative to employment authorization can be establishing a small business with there's just a different tax relationship. And if you go to, I think, United We Dream, there's a lot of information about how to set up your own business, which can be an alternative for people to seek to engage in business as lawfully as they possibly can, notwithstanding barriers that immigration status may place on them at a given time. So thanks, Clark. I thought that's what you meant, and I'm so grateful that you brought it up because it is a great source of information for folks.
Yeah, and I want to note that I think that there's actually a worker co-op in the Hudson Valley that has been able to get set up and do so in ways that, as a member of a co-op, I believe you're able to, provide services so that in a lot of ways, I think you're able to overcome some of the legal restrictions on being able to work without having the work authorization. So I do think there's some creative ideas there. And I'm trying to remember the name of this worker co-op that exists, I believe, in the Mid-Hudson Valley, but there is something that's been stood up there. Thank you. That's an excellent question. Okay, well, with that, I wanted to, I think we're at time, so I wanted to wrap up. I think this has been a great conversation. I wanted to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank David, Jason, and Karen for your insights and for your expertise. And to be able to, I hope this is informative for everybody who is participating. I think we heard some key insights into thinking about narrative and the contributions of immigrants. I think we heard also some great facts about how immigrant workers are contributing significantly to industries like healthcare. And I think we also heard about some of the obstacles that the complexities of immigration law pose and some of the ways in which that can trip up immigrants. And I think we also heard about the broader picture, what community members can do, particularly to support legislation, to support efforts to get more resources and legislation in place to really kind of protect immigrant workers, particularly now and moving forward into the future. So I wanted to thank everybody for that. And I wanted to thank Neighbors Link as well for hosting this conversation. I believe there was a link to the Neighbors Link, the advocacy work that happens there. And I note that there's opportunities to donate, to volunteer. It looks like there's a Friends of Neighbors Link entity that's been set up. I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. And I know that there will be a follow-up email that's sent to everybody on the webinar today with some of these ways in which folks can follow up and get involved. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody and bring this webinar to a close. Really appreciate the time that everybody's putting in. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to you and everybody.